Welcome to the Friendly Circle Berlin Monday workshop. My name is Patrick. It's great to have you all with us today, so many of you. So today's workshop is titled Integrating the Spiritual Path, where 12 steps meet internal family systems, a deeper exploration of healing with Bob Falconer. And we are delighted to have Bob back for his third visit with our community. And Bob will be drawing from his extensive experience as an IFS teacher, writer, and practitioner, as well as his own transformative journey in 12-step recovery, to illuminate the spiritual foundations that underpin both approaches. We'll explore how core principles of IFS align with the spiritual awakening described in the 12 steps, and how this understanding can deepen our recovery journey. And like I said, this is Bob's third visit to our community. We're always so happy when you come visit and speak with us, Bob. And building on the previous workshops on the spiritual dimension of healing, we will explore the profound intersection between 12 steps and internal family systems therapy. This session will delve into how these two powerful frameworks complement each other in the journey of recovery and spiritual growth. The workshop will include discussions on various pathways to spiritual connection and healing, including traditional and contemporary approaches. Bob will address how different modalities can serve as tools for accessing deeper states of consciousness and healing, always within a framework of safety and integration. This session is ideal for those familiar with either IFS or 12-step work, or both, like many of our community are, who wish to deepen their understanding of how these approaches can work together to facilitate profound healing and spiritual growth. Bob, it's just wonderful to have you with us. I want to thank you very much. We really appreciate you. And thank you for doing this and coming back again. So thanks again, Bob. I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you. I hope I can live up to your wonderful introduction. The 12 steps have been a huge part of my life for 30, 40 years. I'm a grateful member of Al Anon and ACA and CODA, and I probably belong in a few others too. This monk, I'm not Roman Catholic, this Roman Catholic monk, Brother David Steindl-Rast, who was very, very famous because he was the first Roman Catholic monk to be trained in Zen Buddhist meditation. Someone asked him once, what's the most important spiritual thing that's happened in the 20th century? And everybody thought he was going to say something about Buddhism or meditation. He said, the 12 steps. He said, they have made spirituality available to everyone in a way that can actually make a difference in their lives. So I'm already emotional. So much of what's called spirituality these days is so highfalutin and out there that people can't use it. It can't touch their hearts. It can't change their lives. To me, that stuff is almost useless. 12 IFS says we're made up of parts. And some of our parts are adults, some are teenagers, and some are little kids, hurt little kids. I just want to point out, it was the ACA movement, the Adult Children of Alcoholics, who really introduced the idea of wounded child to Western culture. It was not therapy land. It was the 12 steps that really opened the door to that whole world. Anyway, lately, and as I was preparing for this talk today, I have a 12-year-old part who's been very, very active. And he wants to say some sort of snarky things that I don't usually get to say in therapy land. IFS and the whole therapy world in general has a bad attitude toward the 12 steps. I think it's because I read this article by this Harvard professor with more degrees than a thermometer. There have been all these studies lately that show that 12 steps do better than any therapy technique treating alcoholism. The data is overwhelmingly clear, but this Harvard professor had to argue with it. And I just thought, what's wrong with these people? I shouldn't be talking like this, but I am. And I think what it is, it's really hard for people who are these world-renowned experts to admit and recognize that a room full of drunks get better results than they do. A room full of ordinary drunks do better than the most fancy-assed academics on the planet. I think this is absolutely wonderful, actually. I really love it. Dick Schwartz, the founder of IFS, also has he sort of welcomes and recognizes the effectiveness of the 12 steps, but still there's this tremendous prejudice in academia against the 12 steps. And I think there's a much deeper root to it. It's not just, they have a hard time admitting that an ordinary room full of drunks do better than they do. There's also, the academics are completely or mostly absorbed in this materialist worldview. And I think to appreciate the 12 steps and actually to appreciate the depths of IFS, you have to get beyond that. You have to start recognizing the validity and importance of spiritual connection. And a lot of people they're just not going to do this. Max Planck, the famous physicist, I think he got the Nobel Prize, he once said, physics proceeds funeral by funeral. Even in physics, which is supposed to be hard science, people don't change their minds. They get some theory and they just won't let go of it. And I also want to say, I think it's only the elites or the so-called elites or self-proclaimed elites who have become so blind to the importance of spirit and spiritual depth. And if you look at materialism as a dominant ideology, it has an absolutely abysmal track record. They're always saying, look at all the damage the churches did, and waving their bony fingers around. But in the century or two we've been materialist, we've had the greatest mass murders ever in the history of humanity. Mao, who, no God in communist China, 80 million dead. Stalin, no God, tens of millions dead. Pol Pot, again, total materialist, killed a third of his countrymen. Materialism is the most lethal and destructive ideology we've ever had on the planet. And yet we're supposed to ignore all that. I actually think this sort of materialist attitude that denies the importance of spirituality is a colonialism of the psyche or soul or mind. It's exactly the same process of imperialist powers sending out invading forces to occupy the rest of who we are. And it's as destructive, and also it provokes revolts. Freud's stuff was clearly like that. The ego was supposed to exert its control over the id, which was this hostile, negative thing. And it was very much a domination structure, imperialist kind of ideology turned inward. I also want to say that our current mental health system is a failure. Or if you want to be a little more kind, it is failing. Something really, really dramatic has to change, not just a little Band-Aid. The data is horrendous. The number, like half the people in America are on antidepressants, and on and on and on and on. The level of human misery is astounding. I mean, it always has been, but it seems even worse lately. I think this materialist attitude, there is no soul, there's no meaning, there's no higher power, there's no, the whole idea of an unseen world or an unseen realm is verboten. You're not supposed to talk about that. You're shunned and, considered as though you're some nut job if you take that stuff seriously. I think it prevents the very thing we need most for deep healing, which is connection to spirit, connection to a higher power. Um, I've come to believe that without some kind of connection to spirit, higher power, self, the divine, whatever you want to call it, some transpersonal level, deep healing from trauma and addiction are not possible. Without that kind of connection, as far as we can get is early recovery white knuckling. Um, I'm saying stuff without the usual qualifiers I would put on here. I'm usually more cautious and kind, but I think I can be blunt in this kind of environment. I think there are two kinds of change, basically. What you could call generative change and counteractive change. I think the paradigm espoused by the academics can only create counteractive change. Counteractive change is like cognitive behavioral therapy. If somebody comes in saying, oh, I've got this belief that I'm an idiot, you sort of have them say, well, I'm actually intelligent. I'm actually intelligent. And you have to counteract that core underlying belief with another one. That will work to a certain degree, but it constantly requires work and it doesn't generate more growth later. And then there's generative change. Now, an example I have of this that is, I think, crystal clear comes from the MDMA studies using MDMA to treat PTSD. And I know that's another whole controversial topic. At the end of one of their protocols, which involved 3 MDMA sessions and I think a dozen therapy sessions, 52% of the people no longer qualified on the written standards for PTSD at all. Now that's an incredible result, better than anybody else was getting. But the truly important result is 1 year later, 68% no longer qualified for PTSD, and there were no further help, no further therapeutic interventions. That's generative change. When we can help create in people something that grows and continues to transform them. We need to be able to create those kinds of changes. Another way this has been talked about, and this is from back in like before World War I, William James talked about conversion experiences because these were usually, in his day, thought of in religious terms. But the fact is, people can have an experience in an afternoon or an hour or in a couple of days that completely turns their life around. That kind of change is possible. It does happen. And I think the reason therapy and therapists won't study this is because we can't create it in people. So it's kind of an embarrassment to the whole therapy profession. But I think the 12 step is more open to this than the therapy world. Hitting bottom. Hitting bottom can be a conversion type experience, something that pivots a person's entire life. And we need to be looking at things like this generative change and these conversion experiences types of change. Because the suffering in our world is so huge, the kind of stuff we've been doing just won't work. It can't work. To focus on these issues in a culture that tries to insist that spirit and all that kind of stuff doesn't exist is very hard. But the evidence is overwhelming. There are all these studies that show that people, who go to church live longer and have less health problems than people who don't, or, people who have some kind of spiritual life are much healthier. But that's still ignored, that we have to open to this. I want to also say this because I think the outer world mirrors our inner world. I don't think it's the other way around. And the fact that I think many of us have engaged in an internal colonialism of our own minds. We have tried to occupy the nether regions of our own mind and control them. I also think the external domination structures, all the hierarchical structures, don't really like it when people develop connections to their own spirit. People who are connected deeply to their own spirit cannot be manipulated. They can't be lied to very easily. They have these roots, it gives them a certain solidity. And they can't be jerked around and fooled and talked into hating each other and stuff like that. So domination structures also do what they can, usually to destroy our connection to spirit. I am making huge generalizations that are way more sweeping than I mean them to be. But that's all I can do in 45 minutes. I want to say that I think both IFS and even more clearly the 12 steps have provided ways to allow spirit back into the center of our discussions and our healing. And in both cases, there's a little bit of sneaking involved. The 12 steps are a lot more honest than the IFS world. I think that the phrase higher power is brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. I mean, it seems so simple, but that allows even the most hidebound, rigid atheist to start to recognize something of spiritual value. I've when I was sponsoring people, sometimes, they were these higher power, to hate any idea like that. And we could go down to the beach and walking alongside the ocean. Which one's bigger, you or the ocean? It makes spirituality undeniable, I think, or it helps us get right-sized in a way that the most rigidly materialist person can accept. So I think that's one way. But the 12 steps are much more open about it. The 12 steps, the 12th of the 12 steps says, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of this program, not a result. I would have thought the result would be sobriety or, freedom from addiction. No, it's a spiritual awakening. It's very explicit, I think, about this is a spiritual program. But IFS is sneakier. I think of it as almost like a Trojan horse. That, we're sneaking spirit back into the elites because most of the academics and the elites, they don't want to hear about this. And the way this is done in IFS is the concept of self. Now, hopefully you guys know something about this or have listened to me on one of my previous talks here. In IFS, we're made up of parts, and there's protectors and exiles, but there's also this thing called self, which is not a part. It's who we really are, or there are a lot of other ways to describe it. And Dick says it's always characterized by 8 C's. It's always curious, compassionate, creative, connected, um, calm, clear, and this is who we really are. It's always the witness. It's always who is seeing, who is witnessing whatever's going on. And working from self is actually inviting spirit in a sort of sneaky Trojan horse kind of way. Dick now says that we all have a self. There's like this sort of particle version of self. And then there's this much vaster wave or field version of self. And he even says there may only be one self. Now, this is sort of a way to sneak in a spiritual awareness and a way to experience and work with spirit in a way which doesn't use any of those words which trigger the hell out of the self-proclaimed elites. And it does provide a spiritual basis for people to work from. I think you can do the first part of recovery, the white knuckling part, without a spiritual connection. But that's as far as you can get. And today I want to focus more on this second part of all the other recovery that comes after that, which for most of us is the vast majority of recovery. Another really important point about welcoming spirituality back in a way that we can actually use, that can actually function in our lives and change the way we behave hour by hour, day by day. How to phrase this? I think you can consider that we live in two worlds, an external world and an inner world, an objective world and a subjective world, the seen world and the unseen world, the world of matter and the world of spirit. I think all those dualities are basically the same duality. So, and we are trained, we are indoctrinated in our schools to only pay attention to the external one. Quote, and this is the whole materialist worldview. That's what's real. All that other stuff is garbage. And you look at what they do to kids. Children have a lot of incredible spiritual experiences. And what the adults tell them is, oh, that's just your imagination. Ignore that. And if you have an imaginary friend, most parents would tell the kid, oh, that's just your imagination. Don't pay attention to that. It's bad to pay attention to that. But now they've done studies, and kids with imaginary friends actually mature more quickly than kids without them. It's very, very helpful, and it helps in exactly the areas that everybody was saying it was going to cause the most damage. Kids with imaginary friends learn how to relate socially more quickly than kids without them. So the materialist sort of worldview and indoctrination of children to ignore their inner world created a lot of damage. So this curiosity about the inner world, in Islam, they talk about the seen world and the unseen world. And the seen world, the world we can see, is ephemeral. It won't last very long. The unseen world is eternal, and that's where we should be paying attention. So I think this whole issue of spirituality can be put in terms of where the focus is. And if you can, or if I as a therapist can get a client to become deeply and genuinely curious about their internal realities, their subjective realms, I think that creates generative change. That's probably, oh, I don't, this is, I'm overstating everything in, in the interest of trying to keep it simple. That's the key to generative change. When people become deeply interested about what's going on inside them, in their depths of who they are. Our inner worlds are vast, maybe more vast than the external world. And we're discouraged from even looking in here, let alone exploring it. You know, and the near in stuff in our inner world is almost always from our own personal life. It's our child parts and the traumas and the memories and the childhood indoctrinations and all of that stuff we have taken in. You start looking, that's probably what's going to be in the foreground. And then you look a little further, you go a little deeper into your mind, you start meeting stuff Carl Jung would call the archetypes and the archetypal realm. And this stuff isn't really 100% human anymore. We're getting to something that's way bigger than any one of us. And as you go further and further into the antipodes of the mind, you start meeting things that are bigger and bigger and bigger. You start meeting higher powers and spirits, and you can make direct internal contact with very powerful forces. I've come to believe that even in the most severely traumatized people, who according to Western psychology shouldn't have any good resources left in them, there is still an ancient healing wisdom in their bones, in their blood, in their breath. And that if we can help those people turn inwards and look through all that pain and suffering of their own lives, they can open to this realm that's vast and luminous, and there's this ancient river of wisdom in them. Now, pretty much, I don't think it matters very much what spiritual path people use. I think what matters is, do they start paying attention inside? Now, there's a word, interoception, which was first, people started talking about it about 1905, I think, 1910. Not much research was done on it until a century later, about 2010. Then all of a sudden there were lots of articles. It means this ability to pay attention to your internal states. If you want a quick way to test your own interoception skills, let's just take a moment here and go inside and see if you can sense your own heartbeat without grabbing a pulse point. Just check that out. Can you do that? That's a very basic interoception skill. If you start exploring this internal realm, it's huge, it's vast. It's like looking into the night sky, with naked eye, you might just see a little bit of black, a little bit of a telescope, you see a few stars, bigger telescope, there's stars and there's galaxies and all this stuff, a huge telescope, and you can see all the way back to the cosmic background radiation and the beginnings of our universe. So these interoception skills are not just theoretically interesting. It's been discovered, and there's all this boring statistical demonstration of this, that poor interoception skills are very highly correlated with a lot of really nasty stuff. They're correlated with eating disorders. Now, I think of eating disorders as an addiction. I don't think anybody has studied poor interoception skills and addictions at a larger scale. If there are any of you out there who want a dissertation topic, I think this would be a great one. There are studies that show poor interoception, eating disorders. poor interoception, treatment-resistant depression, poor interoception, borderline personality disorder. So poor interoception predicts all sorts of trouble and probably addictions too, even though I don't have any studies about that. The good news is interoception is very, very trainable. You can learn to pay attention to your inner world. And most of it is just once you're genuinely curious about what's going on in there, the learning goes on its own. You don't need, textbooks or something. And I actually think once you turn in there and get a taste, it's absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And there's depth beyond depth. This very same subject has been approached by anthropologists, and they don't know about the interoception studies, and they have their whole own language about it. They call it inner sense cultivation. And there was a guy back, I think his name was Hull, back in the 1980s, who wrote a paper that was very famous saying inner sense cultivation is the essence of all the trainings for shamans. That they learn how to navigate in these inner realms of the subjective. And just as they've discovered with interoception, inner sense cultivation is trainable. It's a doable thing. The wonderful anthropologist Tanya Luhrmann has said that in most religions, prayer is actually a method of inner sense cultivation. You learn how to navigate, to deeply navigate your internal world, and to have personal relationships with spirit. So I think to try and boil this down to something that works, that you can use on a daily basis, being deeply curious about your own internal realities. That if you start and walk down that path, it can change your life totally. Because I think it just gets more and more fascinating. The more I discover about my inner worlds, every time I think I've answered a question, 10 new, more interesting questions pop up. And I have thousands and thousands of pages of journals recording my explorations of my inner world. One other thing I want to say, some people, the Western attitude is, oh, this is just imagination and, you're wasting your time and all that kind of stuff. Henri Corbin, this French guy, wrote a lot about what he called the imaginal realm. And he's talking about the same stuff we are with this inner realm and interoception and all of that. And he said, he talked about this he was a specialist in Sufi mysticism. And he said learning how to enter the imaginal realm and navigate there was the core to Sufi mysticism. And he's so brilliant, he's really hard to read. But I think what he's saying is the same thing we're talking about. And I want to give you a very specific example about this. These dream images and deep imaginal realm is really important to how we live. It's not some frill. Milton Erickson was a psychiatrist and one of the greatest healers of the 20th century. When he was a young man, he had polio, and his parents were told he was going to die, and he almost did. I mean, he was really a mess. He was so paralyzed that all they could do is put him in a chair. He lived in a farmhouse in the Midwest, and they put him in a rocking chair, and they had to put a band around his forehead so his head wouldn't slump forward. And, they had to strap his arms to the arms of the chair so they wouldn't fall off. I mean, he was really totally paralyzed. And in his little upstairs bedroom, they'd put that chair, that rocking chair, in front of a window so he at least could look out, and everything seemed like totally dismal. He was only like 13. And then one day he fell asleep and took a nap in that rocking chair. And when he woke up, he realized the rocking chair had moved a little bit. And he got all excited. And he thought, what was I dreaming about? What was I dreaming about in that nap? And he realized he was dreaming about climbing apple trees and climbing trees, which he used to love to do. And he thought, somehow that must have enabled me to move my paralyzed body. And it did. And he started working with dream images and stuff like that. And he could get a finger. At first, he could just get a little finger twitch. But he kept working in this imaginal realm, and he got back to being able to walk. There is great power in this stuff. I mean, it's not just some little game people play. Also, I think this realm, the imaginal or the unseen, whatever you want to call it, is responsible for our sense of meaning. Meaning, spiritual connection and meaning go hand in hand. And, in the academic materialist worldview, meaning is like icing you put on the cake. And that idea is absolute garbage. It's bull bleep. It's poison. Poison, poison. Viktor Frankl was so clear about this. The Jewish psychiatrist who was one of the longest term survivors in the camps. And he said, when somebody lost their ability to make meaning out of their existence, they would die in a day or two. And he said all the other inmates knew who had done that. And they had some name I've forgotten for these guys who lost their sense of meaning. And they did. They would die if they couldn't somehow make meaning. And he talked about for himself, one day he was walking or marching back from a work detail, snowy, cold, exhausted, starving, and he fell into a snowbank. And he just didn't give a damn anymore. And the guard was coming over, getting his gun ready, because that's what they did. They just shot people who fell. And Viktor Frankl thought of his giving a lecture on the importance of meaning to a room full of psychiatrists back in Vienna after the war. And that gave him meaning. That would not give me meaning. It probably wouldn't help most of you, but it was his meaning and it worked. He got back up. So meaning is not some trivial little thing. It determines who lives and who dies, who thrives and who doesn't. And I think who recovers from severe addiction and who doesn't. And this meaning comes from this inner world, the world of the unseen, the spirit world, whatever you want to call it. Meaning has to be individual. If you ask the question, what is the meaning of life? I think that's like asking, what's the best move in a game of chess? That's like a dumb question, right? You can't answer it. Each person's life at each moment has a specific meaning in that instant or not, so it has to be like that. I don't think we can answer these universal questions about this kind of stuff. So meaning also comes from this inner realm, and it's super important. High interoception skills and a powerful sense of meaning. And I think you've got a person who's spiritually connected, who has roots, who can't be pushed around, and will probably have really good tools for long-term recovery. Let's see. One thing, my 12-year-old is coming back. He's pissed off. And he's been pissed off for 50 years now. And he likes to have a chance to let it out a little bit. One of the things that the academics do that just drives me nuts is they have to create new names for everything. In academic therapy land, you're not supposed to use the word addict anymore. You're supposed to say substance use disorder. And they're talking about SUDS. I mean, God, how dishonest. Please. I like the word addiction. It's, honest, direct, straightforward, but you're not supposed to say that anymore. Oh, God. Okay, so let me see. Okay, so I want to talk briefly about the IFS model of healing from addictions, because I want to show you how this is sort of letting spirituality in the back door. In IFS, we think of an addiction as a polarization. There's always at least two things involved in an addiction. One part is the part that wants to drink. I want to drink. I don't care. And there's another part that's going, you idiot, you got drunk yesterday. No, we're not going to have a drink. And they go like this, bam, 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 bam. An internal civil war. And both sides' answer to this is to get bigger guns and to shoot each other even harder, right? And bam, 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 bam. And most addicts come to think this is absolutely hopeless. If that's all there was in your inner world, it would be absolutely hopeless. But it's not. And when people start gaining some interoception skills, they start to realize there's all sorts of other stuff in here besides this internal civil war. The first thing in IFS we want people to get a sense of is there is a self. There is some kind of witness function that can witness both sides of this internal civil war from a place of compassion, or at least a place of curiosity. You don't really need compassion to do good work, but you do need curiosity. If you can't be curious about both sides of that polarization, you're stuck in the water. That's some other part. So the first step in IFS, working with an addiction, is to get that self-part relationship between the self and both sides of this polarization, and get those parts in the polarization to stop fighting each other, probably to stop relating to each other at all, and get them to start relating to self. Some bigger entity, and now we're sneaking in the higher power, right? Some bigger entity that can witness both sides of that problem and be curious, what's going on here? What are you trying to do? So also in IFS, there's basically that, and that's the very first step. You get self-part relationship with both the active, what we would call the firefighter in IFS, and the manager who doesn't like what the firefighter's doing. And then there's also the firefighter. Both of these parts are almost always protecting hurt exiles behind them. They are doing something to overcome unbearable emotional pain behind them. And the offer we make is we can help, we can relieve that pain without you having to go get drunk. And usually the drinking part will say, oh, you're full of shit, you can't do that. And we just say, hey, how about giving us a chance? As an experiment, just let us show to you that we can. And that's sort of the basic approach. So not only do you have the civil war, you have the self that can witness both. And then when you've got that kind of relationship going on, you go back and you go to the underlying pain. Gabor Mate said, I never ask why the addiction, I ask why the pain. So that's the basic model. And it's sneaking in spirituality through this self. This idea of self is actually a center of spirituality. In my personal healing recovery, which a lot of it's been in Al-Anon, just because where I live, there's so many meetings I would fit into. Where I live, there are a lot of great Al-Anon meetings. And in Al-Anon, we talk about the first three steps as the Al-Anon waltz. Those are the three steps we need to do every day, every hour, every minute, probably. But they're all about, finding this self, this higher power. Hello, what I'm doing isn't working. These managers over here are failing to control this acting out behavior. There's something bigger than me that can do it, and I'm going to let that bigger thing, bigger being do it. Of course, there's a necessity for the early stages of recovery, the white knuckling. I used to teach IFS in an eating disorders clinic a few times, and a lot of people die of anorexia. There's a high mortality rate for young anorexic women, and so sometimes you have to just join with those managers and overpower that anorexic part, and use force, but we don't do it from a punitive place of you idiot, you're wrong, what a jerk you are, how dare you, nothing like that. We say, yeah, it makes sense you're trying to control the suffering, and we're going to do everything we can to keep the body alive, and we're going to come back and work with you and help you. So that's a very quick view of how IFS sneaks spirituality into healing in a way that's academically acceptable. And I hope someday soon we won't have to be sneaking around like this. And we can just come in the front door and say, yeah, there's something bigger than we are, and an ancient wisdom, and we all have our own deep access to it if we would only look. Okay, I think I'll shut up. I'm really looking forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you, Bob.